Episode 7, Troubling Visitors. What happens when the rules of home follow you abroad? Have you ever heard the expression wearing out one's welcome? It describes what happens when guests become an inconvenience, when the warmth of arrival gives way to something more complicated. Most of us have heard of it happening. Some of us have lived it. In 2016, I hosted relatives for a 3-week stay at my small apartment in Germany. I had not seen them in over 3 years, and I was genuinely excited. I was also, based on past experience, a little apprehensive. What followed was one of the most instructive and at times one of the most difficult intercultural experiences of my life. And for years, I lacked the vocabulary to explain what had actually happened. I had the feelings. I had the memories. What I did not have was the framework. This episode is about what I found when I finally looked for it. The first days were good. My apartment was small, but I was single and younger then, and I genuinely wanted the company. I understood that things would be cramped, and I was prepared for that. What I was less prepared for was what would happen outside those 4 walls. Early on, I did what felt natural to me after years of living in Germany. I explained the rules of the apartment complex, the quiet hours, the recycling system, the cleaning rota for shared spaces. I went through it carefully and clearly. My relatives nodded throughout. They seemed to understand completely. They had not understood a word of it, not because they lacked intelligence, but because high-context people are simply not wired to receive information the way low-context people deliver it. A list of explicit rules delivered in sequence lands on high-context ears the way a legal document lands on most people. The words register, but the meaning does not stick. Their nodding meant they heard sounds coming from my mouth, not that they would follow the instructions. Over the following weeks, the incidents accumulated. Not dramatically, no single moment was catastrophic on its own, but each one added to a growing weight. In public, my relatives were loud and animated in the way that is perfectly normal in Brazil and reads as disruptive in Germany. They addressed strangers in English with the playful, humor-first approach of high-context Brazilians, the kind of communication that works beautifully when there is a shared social framework and falls completely flat when there is not. On a train, they could not understand why we were not allowed to sit in the empty first-class section when the second-class carriage was packed. The rule felt arbitrary to them because the cultural logic behind it was invisible. They also complained about the train delays. The irony of that was considerable. On what moral ground can someone from Brazil, where virtually nothing runs on schedule, complain about a German train running late? At a restaurant, one of my relatives lit a candle at the table with his own lighter. The waitress was visibly offended. He then ate from a bag of peanuts he had brought while we waited for our food. At another restaurant, when a fly landed in a low-context friend's beer, my relative was horrified that our friend simply removed the fly and kept drinking. He insisted that a replacement should be demanded, that it was the restaurant's fault for letting a fly into the establishment. I am grateful, in retrospect, for eventually learning about cultural dimensions, because for years I genuinely thought my relative was simply stupid. Instead, he was a high-context person, operating by high-context logic in a low-context world, and nobody had ever told him the rules of that world were different. Several apartment complexes in Germany operate a cleaning rota. Residents take turns maintaining the shared spaces, the stairwell, the corridor, the entrance. The system is organized, expected, and taken seriously. I had explained this clearly to my relatives, which, as we have established, meant they had not absorbed it. One evening, I came home from work to find one of my relatives cheerfully cleaning the shared corridor. It was not my week. I panicked. I reminded him firmly of the system. He shrugged. He was just doing something nice, he said. A kind gesture for the older neighbor down the hall, with whom I had barely exchanged more than a polite greeting. I tried to explain that this was not how it would be interpreted, that in this context, cleaning outside your assigned week did not signal generosity. It signaled disorder, presumption, a disregard for the system that everyone had agreed to follow. His nonchalance, the casual dismissal of my concern, the inability to see why any of this mattered, pushed me over an edge I had not known was there. For the first time in my life, at 25 years old, I shouted at my older relatives. Not firmly, not sternly. I shouted, and I said things I should not have said, and I had to leave the apartment for several hours because I could not be in the same space as them. The following day, I went back and apologized for what I had said. I received no apology in return, which is in line with high-context features of reluctance to admit one's wrongs, so as to save face. And it was never acknowledged, not then and not since, that they had broken not my personal rules, but the rules of the country they were visiting, that in doing so, they had put my social standing with my neighbors at risk. Later in the same visit came the box of chocolates suggestion. My visa had been taking an unusually long time to process. My relative offered his advice. Go to the immigration office and bring your case officer a box of chocolates. When I explained that this would be interpreted as a bribe, he insisted it would work. In Brazil, in many high-context, relationship-oriented societies, building personal rapport with officials through small gifts is a perfectly normal social lubricant. In Germany, it is not a gesture, it is a criminal act. Same intention, completely different world. After those 3 weeks, I found myself holding something uncomfortable, a generalized negative view of people from my own country. In my mind, for a period, they would all behave like my relatives had. I carried that unfairness for longer than I should have. Learning about cultural dimensions did not excuse the behavior I had witnessed, but it dissolved the resentment, because I understood finally that my relatives had not been careless or disrespectful out of malice. They had been operating by a code that worked perfectly well at home and had never been given the tools to switch codes abroad. That gap between what is normal at home and what is expected elsewhere has consequences that extend far beyond individual visits. Japan has begun posting signs in certain establishments explicitly restricting foreign entry. Spain and other European countries are seeing anti-tourist protests, communities pushing back against visitor behavior that has reshaped their neighborhoods, their economies, and their daily lives. Whether you agree with those reactions or not, the pattern is undeniable. The behavior of individual visitors accumulates into a reputation that attaches to everyone who follows them. When you travel, you carry your culture with you. You are, whether you choose it or not, an ambassador. The visit, on balance, was a good one. There were real moments of warmth and connection that I value to this day. The friction does not erase those, but the lesson it taught me is one I carry into every new country, every new city, every interaction with someone whose rules I do not yet know. When you are a guest, abroad, or even within your own country, you are an outsider. You do not master the local rules. Behave accordingly. Be ready to apologize. Ask questions before you act, because if your behavior ruins someone's day, you may be doing more than causing a momentary inconvenience. You may be quietly closing a door for the next person who comes from where you come from. Not to judge, to understand. Next time, we leave the apartment and go to work. A multicultural office in Northern Europe, a colleague who quietly arranged better shifts for his compatriots, and the collision between two ideas that both call themselves fairness but mean completely different things. Particularism versus universalism. See you then.